He never expected to see her again, not in this lifetime, and certainly not here. Yet, there she stood. Boston University Hospital, a sprawling medical complex in the heart of the city. It was Thursday afternoon, exactly 2:47. The gray November frost clung to the massive glass windows like a bitter memory that simply refused to be wiped away, casting a cold, metallic glow over the bustling hospital corridors. Mark Williams walked through the automatic sliding doors of the main entrance, accompanied by his eager assistant, moving with the brisk, commanding stride of a man entirely accustomed to the world stepping out of his way. He was 40 years old, wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit imported straight from Milan, and a wristwatch worth more than what an average American earns in 3 entire years. He possessed a heart that, as he repeatedly told his corporate colleagues, existed strictly for business and relentless ambition. He had come merely to visit his aging father. That was supposed to be everything. It was meant to be a completely routine consultation regarding a planned, albeit complex, heart surgery. Nothing more and nothing less. But fate, that ruthless and uninvited director of human dramas, had orchestrated a vastly different scenario for him. As the young receptionist, Claire, pointed him toward the correct department, Mark moved down the long hallway lined with pristine white tiles that reflected the sterile fluorescent lights from the ceiling above. The sharp, distinct scent of clinical disinfectants mixed seamlessly with the chilly air of the hospital's central air conditioning. All around him, busy orderlies hurried past with carts of supplies. Frail patients shuffled slowly along the walls, leaning heavily on their IV stands, while the monitors inside the open rooms beeped softly and rhythmically, sounding exactly like the beating of fragile hearts fighting desperately to endure another day. And then, through the sea of scrubs and white coats, he saw her. She was standing quietly by a large window at the very end of the corridor, her back turned to him, dressed in a crisp, white physician's coat that was buttoned meticulously up to the collar. Her dark hair, casually tied back, fell softly against her neck. She was holding a thick patient file in her hands and speaking in a calm, measured tone to a senior nurse standing beside her. Her voice was soft and deeply professional, yet it was a voice that Mark would have instantly recognized out of 1,000 others, perhaps even out of 1,000,000. He stopped dead in his tracks. He did not stop because he consciously wanted to. He was forcibly halted by his own legs, which suddenly refused to obey any frantic commands from his stunned brain. His assistant nearly bumped into him, turning around with a look of profound confusion at his boss's abrupt and uncharacteristic stillness. "Mr. Williams, is everything all right?" the assistant asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. Mark did not offer a single word in response. The woman standing by the frost-covered window slowly turned toward the sound of his name, and for Mark, the entire spinning world violently ground to a halt. Dr. Sophia Carter, 32 years old, stood before him. She possessed those same deep, honey-brown eyes that had once looked up at him with boundless, unwavering trust. Now, however, those beautiful eyes looked at him as if he were merely someone she vaguely recognized from a faded photograph of a past life, like a ghost, who technically existed but no longer held any real presence in her world. A fleeting shadow of old, buried pain and a quick flash of pure surprise crossed her face for a fraction of a second. Then, her impenetrable medical mask slipped perfectly back into place, as seamlessly as if it had never vanished. "Mr. Williams," she said calmly, devoid of any smile, "I understand you are here regarding your father. I will see you both in just a moment." 8 years earlier, Sophia Carter was certainly not a respected cardiologist. She was an exhausted fourth-year medical student at a prestigious Boston University, a hopeful girl originally from Chicago who had arrived in Massachusetts with a single battered suitcase, a hard-earned academic scholarship, and a dream so massive that it barely fit into her tiny, cramped dormitory room on Commonwealth Avenue. She met Mark entirely by accident, in the exact way one usually meets the very people who will unexpectedly and permanently alter the entire trajectory of one's life. It was late autumn. Sophia was walking home late from the campus library, carrying a heavy stack of thick cardiology textbooks under her arm, when she slipped on a patch of wet, decaying leaves at a busy crosswalk on Newbury Street, sending all her expensive books tumbling onto the cold, damp pavement. There was a crowded bus stop, a sudden downpour of freezing rain, and then there was him, a young, dark-haired, intensely focused man in a stylish leather jacket, who crouched down without uttering a single word and began gathering her scattered textbooks. He read the heavy titles aloud as he picked them up. Cardiology, Advanced Pharmacology, Pathological Anatomy, he noted, handing the heavy stack back to her with a slow, charming smile. Either you are striving to become a brilliant doctor, or you just have a very unusual and morbid hobby. Sophia laughed despite her frustration, and exactly like that, their grand, complicated story began. Mark Williams was, at that specific time, a 32-year-old rising entrepreneur who was just beginning to aggressively expand his very first major technology startup. He was not a multi-millionaire yet. He was fiercely standing right on the precipice of massive success. He possessed boundless ambition, raw energy, and a charismatic smile that effortlessly illuminated any room he walked into. However, he also harbored a deep, underlying trait that Sophia did not immediately recognize. He had an overwhelming, all-consuming need for total control, a relentless drive that eventually proved to be significantly stronger than his capacity for unconditional love. For 2 solid years, they painstakingly built a relationship that felt entirely indestructible to both of them. They took long, romantic walks along the freezing Charles River on dark winter evenings, when the water was covered in a thin sheet of ice and Boston shimmered with thousands of distant, twinkling lights. They ate warm, baked potatoes in a tiny, obscure tavern in the North End, where the cheerful owner, Sarah, knew them both by their first names and always saved their favorite corner booth. They laughed together late into the night, discussing absolutely everything under the sun. They talked passionately about modern medicine, the cutthroat world of business, the future of the country, global politics, and the secret, quiet dreams they had carried inside their hearts since they were innocent children. But as his corporate empire aggressively expanded, the emotional space he reserved for her tragically shrank. Initially, it was just a few annoying delays for scheduled dinner dates, then it escalated to dozens of unreturned phone calls, and eventually, it became a heavy, suffocating absence that completely filled their shared apartment, even on those rare occasions when he was physically present in the room. Sophia endured the crushing loneliness for months. She tried desperately to communicate with him. She pleaded, she rationally explained her feelings, and she cried bitterly, though only once, secretly sitting on the bathroom floor with the shower running loudly so he would not hear her sobs. And then came that dreadful spring evening. Mark returned home incredibly late, his handsome face locked tight and impenetrable, like the heavy steel door of a bank vault. He sat heavily by the large living room window and said, completely avoiding her eyes, "Sophia, we simply cannot continue like this anymore. My professional life is rapidly heading in a direction that absolutely does not leave any room for compromises." He did not explicitly say, "I do not have any room left for you," but that was precisely the devastating message she heard echoing in the silent room. She quietly picked up her leather bag, put on her light spring coat, and walked out of the apartment without uttering a single syllable in response. She deliberately left her apartment keys on the kitchen counter, right next to a small, checkered notebook, where she routinely copied down complex medical quotes. On the very first page of that notebook, a long time ago, she had jokingly written his first name surrounded by a slightly crooked heart, drawn in bright blue ink. She never once went back to retrieve it. Now, 8 long years later, they stood frozen in this brightly lit hospital corridor, separated by the stark whiteness of the clinical walls and the vast, unbridgeable chasm of everything terrible that had happened, and everything important that had been left entirely unsaid. Mark silently followed her into her private consultation office. Sophia sat down rigidly on the opposite side of her heavy wooden desk, opened the thick file containing his father's medical records, and began speaking in a brisk, highly professional tone. She detailed the recent laboratory results, the meticulously planned surgical procedure, the statistical risks involved, and the overall long-term prognosis. Her voice was remarkably steady, wonderfully calm, and absolutely, perfectly controlled. Mark simply stared at her face, completely unable to process a single medical term she was speaking. Instead, he found himself staring intensely at her slender hands. They were the exact same gentle hands that had once lovingly cradled his face in the dark, now gripping complex medical documentation with the fierce precision of someone who had spent 8 grueling years learning exactly how to replace profound personal grief with relentless, exhausting work. "Do you have any questions at all regarding this procedure?" she finally asked, lifting her intense, honey-brown gaze from the heavy paperwork. Their eyes instantly locked for one singular, agonizing second. It was just one brief moment, yet that tiny fraction of time comfortably held absolutely everything. 2 beautiful years together, 1 devastating spring of separation, and 8 agonizing years of complete and utter silence. "Yes," Mark finally whispered softly, for the very first time, completely lacking his usual domineering confidence. "But my question is not about my father." Sophia slowly placed her silver pen on the desk. For a long, painful moment, she sat entirely motionless, staring blankly at the smooth wooden surface of her desk. "Mr. Williams," she stated eventually, her voice calm but containing something incredibly hard beneath it, resembling thick, unyielding ice, perfectly hidden beneath a soft layer of fresh snow. "I am strictly your father's attending physician, and it is solely in that specific professional capacity that we are permitted to converse." Outside the large window of her clinical office, the historic city of Boston was completely drowning in a thick, gray November fog. Somewhere deep in the bustling city, the grand bells of a historic church on Beacon Hill struck 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And Mark Williams, a powerful man who had never backed down from any fight, who had built a massive financial empire purely on relentless stubbornness and cold, calculating logic, felt for the very first time in 8 years that there was something in this world he could not simply buy, forcibly acquire, or manipulate: his past, and the remarkable woman he had carelessly abandoned on a rainy evening. There were specific, unyielding routines that Sophia Carter meticulously performed every single morning, just to survive the weight of her memories. She always woke up at exactly 6 o'clock. She brewed a strong cup of dark black coffee, strictly without any sugar, because the lingering taste of sweetness always felt too much like a dangerous emotional compromise. She left her quiet apartment exactly at 7 o'clock, walking with the determined, purposeful stride of a woman who knew exactly where she was going and why. She was always the very first doctor to arrive on the cardiac ward. She treated her vulnerable patients with an intense, unwavering focus that most people reserve only for the most important, life-altering events in their entire existence. In the late evenings, she returned home thoroughly exhausted, but enveloped in a strange, protective calm. The specific type of calm that a person painstakingly builds over many years while standing precariously on the edge of a bottomless cliff, laying down defensive stones one by one until the terrifying drop is no longer visible. That impenetrable routine was her shiny, protective armor, and it had functioned flawlessly for exactly 8 years, 4 months, and 17 days, right up until this fateful Thursday afternoon. That night, Sophia sat alone in the doctor's break room at the far end of the cardiology wing, pretending to diligently review patient charts. The cup of herbal tea sitting near her elbow had gone completely cold hours ago. Outside the window, Boston sat in total silence, beneath a heavy, suffocating blanket of thick winter clouds. Those dark, oppressive December clouds that hang perilously low over the city skyline, like a massive, unpaid debt. Martha, the veteran head nurse, a sturdy woman in her late 50s, with a weathered face that had witnessed every conceivable human tragedy, and thus was surprised by absolutely nothing, quietly pushed open the heavy door. "Dr. Carter," The younger Williams is asking if he could possibly speak with you, for just a few moments. He is currently waiting out in the main hallway, Martha announced softly. Sophia did not even lift her tired eyes from the glowing screen of her tablet. Please tell him that my office is officially closed for the night. If he has any pressing medical inquiries, he is more than welcome to schedule a formal consultation for tomorrow morning. Martha lingered in the open doorway for a few extra seconds. He specifically mentioned that these are definitely not medical questions, the older nurse gently pointed out. I am fully aware of that, Sophia replied flatly, offering absolutely no further explanation. Martha gave a slow, understanding nod and quietly exited the room, gently clicking the heavy door shut, with the profound delicacy of someone who intimately understands far more than they are technically supposed to know. Sophia immediately set down her tablet, propped her elbows heavily on the cold desk, and for a very long time buried her exhausted face in her hands. These were the exact same hands that had carefully examined the failing heart of the elder Mr. Williams earlier that afternoon, and they had visibly trembled for a brief second when she fully comprehended the severe, life-threatening reality of his deteriorating medical condition. She was not trembling because she feared performing the incredibly difficult surgery. She was deeply terrified of something else entirely. She was terrified that she would inevitably have to tell his estranged son the painful truth, and that this shared, heavy truth would inevitably construct a fragile emotional bridge between them. A bridge that neither of them had ever actively requested or wanted to build again. Thomas Williams was exactly 68 years old, and he possessed a battered heart that, as Sophia herself had meticulously noted in his official medical chart, was already functioning dangerously close to the absolute limit of its physical capacity. He suffered from severe aortic valve stenosis. The surgical intervention was absolutely imperative, yet it carried a significantly higher risk than the standard procedure due to the patient's advanced age and a host of complicating secondary illnesses. She had first met the older man exactly 3 weeks prior, when he had been rushed into the busy emergency room complaining of severe shortness of breath and crushing chest pain. He was a remarkably quiet, incredibly tough man, possessing the rough, calloused hands of someone who had engaged in grueling physical labor his entire life, long before his ambitious son had built a lucrative tech empire and could comfortably provide for him. He carried himself with a quiet, powerful dignity that completely eliminated the need for unnecessary conversation. During their second consultation, he had looked her dead in the eye and asked bluntly, "Doctor, am I actually going to survive this operation or not?" Sophia had met his intense gaze without flinching. "We are going to do absolutely everything within our medical power," she promised firmly. "But you have to promise to help me. No hiding any sudden symptoms, and absolutely no downplaying your pain. I need to know absolutely everything." The older Mr. Williams had stared at her intently for a long, silent moment. "You are the very first doctor in this massive building who has actually told me the blunt truth, instead of trying to pacify me like a terrified child," he finally said in a low, raspy voice. "I deeply respect that." From that precise moment onward, a profound and entirely unspoken bond formed between Sophia and her stubborn patient. A deep, mutual trust that is completely invaluable in the complex world of medicine. However, neither of them had any idea at that time that Thomas Williams's wealthy son was the exact same Mark Williams whose handsome face Sophia had spent 8 grueling years desperately trying to permanently erase from her fragile memory. When she finally saw him that fateful Thursday in the brightly lit corridor, she felt the solid floor momentarily vanish from beneath her feet. It was only for a tiny fraction of a second. Immediately afterward, her professional mask slammed back into place, her emotional armor hardened, and everything she had painstakingly built over the years returned. Yet, something incredibly dangerous remained. A tiny, microscopic crack in her porcelain defenses, completely invisible to the outside world, but glaringly obvious to the woman who knew exactly where to look. At 10 o'clock that evening, long after the last restless patients had finally fallen asleep and the bustling ward had transformed into a quiet, peaceful space, filled only with whispering monitors and muffled footsteps, Sophia stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The hospital courtyard was entirely deserted at this late hour. There were only a few wooden benches dusted with a thin layer of fresh snow, and a single flickering street lamp casting a dull yellow glow against the wet brick pavement. She stood frozen there, greedily inhaling the freezing, biting air, gratefully feeling the sharp frost fill her tired lungs, completely replacing every other overwhelming emotion for just a few seconds. "Sophia!" A deep, familiar voice called out from the shadows behind her. She did not immediately turn around to face him. Instead, she stood perfectly still for several long seconds, staring blankly out into the dark, freezing night. "I explicitly instructed Martha to tell you that I absolutely do not receive visitors after my scheduled working hours," Sophia stated in a remarkably calm voice, still refusing to look back over her shoulder. "I know," Mark replied softly. His slow, heavy footsteps echoing on the wet bricks were deeply hesitant, resembling the careful approach of a man desperately trying not to frighten away a wild, unpredictable animal. "But I simply could not bring myself to leave." "You certainly can. The main hospital doors remain unlocked 24 hours a day," she countered sharply. Mark stepped up completely beside her, maintaining a respectful distance of several paces, as if he profoundly understood that every single inch of space between them carried immense, delicate significance tonight. For a very long time, both of them stood in absolute silence. Somewhere far off in the distance, the wailing siren of a rushing ambulance violently pierced the freezing night air. It was a piercing sound that, for Sophia, had long ago ceased to represent a sudden, terrifying tragedy, and had instead simply become the ordinary, background music of her daily existence. "How is he actually doing?" Mark finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, give me the honest truth, not the sanitized version you usually prepare for the family." Sophia finally slowly turned her head and looked directly at him. Standing there in the dim, yellow light of the solitary street lamp, Mark's face looked remarkably different than it had earlier in the clinical corridor. He looked significantly less like a ruthless corporate titan in an expensive suit, and much more like a terrified, helpless son terrified of losing his father. And witnessing this specific vulnerability, this raw, fragile humanity fully exposed beneath his usual arrogant shell, was the most difficult thing for her to endure. "The surgical procedure is absolutely mandatory," she stated plainly, "and it is extremely urgent. Every single week we delay significantly increases the potential risk of massive heart failure. Your father is fully aware of this grim reality. You should clearly understand it as well." Mark stared deeply into her eyes for several long seconds, without uttering a single word, absorbing the devastating medical reality. "Why exactly didn't you explain all of this to me earlier, while we were sitting inside your office?" he questioned, his voice thick with unexpressed emotion. "Because while we were in my office, you were entirely focused on asking questions that were not remotely related to his medical care," she replied with a cold, unwavering calm. "And now, you are finally asking me as a concerned son. That is an entirely different conversation." Something profoundly heavy shifted in his expression. A massive, invisible wall inside him seemed to suffer a microscopic fracture. "For 8 long years," he started speaking very slowly, "I honestly believed that—" "Mark," she abruptly cut him off. Her voice was surprisingly gentle, yet as fiercely final as the heavy slamming of a steel door. "Not tonight. We are absolutely not doing this tonight." Before he could even attempt to formulate a response, she quickly turned on her heel and swiftly retreated back into the warm, brightly lit hospital. The heavy glass doors clicked firmly shut behind her, a sharp, decisive sound that echoed far louder than any spoken words ever could. Mark was left standing entirely alone in the freezing, empty courtyard. The winter snow began to fall, softly and silently, gently covering his dark coat and the cold, wet pavement of the sprawling city. On Friday morning, Thomas Williams woke up feeling significantly worse. When Sophia arrived at 7:30, Nurse Martha handed her the updated charts with a grim expression. His oxygen saturation had dangerously plummeted to 89 during the night. Dr. Kelly, the attending night physician, had frantically adjusted his medications and placed him on supplemental oxygen. But the stark reality was undeniable. The elderly man's frail heart was rapidly giving out. Sophia immediately rushed into room number 7. Thomas was lying flat on his back, a clear plastic mask strapped securely over his pale face, his breathing visibly labored. Despite his immense discomfort, he managed to offer her a weak, trembling smile. "It feels exactly like there is a massive, crushing stone sitting right on top of my chest, doctor," he wheezed softly. "That is the dangerously high pressure severely building up in your damaged valve," Sophia explained gently but firmly, pulling up a small stool beside his bed. "Mr. Williams, the frightening episode you experienced last night clearly dictates that we absolutely cannot afford to wait any longer. We must move the surgery up to next Wednesday. It is no longer an option. It is an absolute necessity." The tough old man slowly nodded his gray head in quiet resignation. "Mark knows about my sudden decline," Thomas murmured through the heavy oxygen mask. "I had the nurses call him at the crack of dawn. He is probably pacing a hole in your waiting room right now." He paused, taking a slow, rattling breath. "You know, Dr. Carter, my son is a brilliant genius when it comes to making money, but he is an absolute fool when it comes to matters of the human heart." Sophia maintained a perfectly neutral expression, refusing to take the conversational bait. She carefully adjusted his intravenous drip and offered a few words of clinical comfort before stepping out. At exactly 9 o'clock, she formally summoned Mark to her office. He arrived 5 minutes early, completely lacking his arrogant corporate swagger. He looked absolutely terrified. She bluntly laid out the terrifying medical facts: the rapid deterioration, the mandatory bumped-up timeline for the invasive surgery, the significantly elevated risks. Mark sat in absolute silence, listening intently to every single terrifying word. When she finally finished her bleak assessment, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the small room. "What exactly can we do to ensure he survives this?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "We keep him perfectly calm," Sophia instructed firmly. "Absolutely no emotional stress, no arguments, no difficult conversations, until he is safely out of the recovery room." Mark nodded slowly. Then, breaking her own strict professional rules, Sophia leaned forward. "Exactly how long did you know his heart was failing, Mark?" she asked, dropping the formal titles completely. Mark looked down at his trembling hands. He casually mentioned some chest pains about 3 months ago, but he aggressively insisted it was just indigestion, and I foolishly chose to believe him because I was too incredibly busy closing a massive merger, he confessed, his voice breaking with profound guilt. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, all the lingering bitterness vanished, leaving only two terrified people desperate to save a life. The surgery was officially set for Wednesday. Wednesday morning arrived with a brutal, howling wind violently sweeping across Boston. Sophia was already scrubbing into the sterile operating room at 6:15. Her trusted surgical resident, Michael, quietly informed her that Mark was pacing frantically in the waiting area outside. The immense pressure was palpable, but Sophia forced her mind into a state of absolute, icy focus. The complex surgery dragged on for an agonizing 4 hours and 20 minutes. Outside, Mark never once checked his expensive phone. He sat rigid on a cheap plastic chair, his head buried deep in his hands, silently praying to a God he had largely ignored for decades. Every time Martha walked past, she offered him a small, sympathetic nod, eventually bringing him a steaming cup of tea. When the heavy double doors of the surgical wing finally pushed open, Sophia emerged. She was physically exhausted, her blue scrubs damp with sweat, the surgical mask pulled down around her neck. Mark shot up from his chair instantly, his eyes silently begging for answers. "He made it!" she exhaled deeply. The critical valve replacement was entirely successful. "He is resting in the intensive care unit now." Mark let out a ragged, trembling breath, instantly covering his face, as a single tear escaped his tight control. "Sophia," he whispered, entirely dropping her professional title. "Thank you. Thank you so much." She did not correct him. For a fleeting second, they simply stood together in the stark fluorescent light, united by a profound, shared relief that momentarily transcended their painful, broken history. 3 long weeks later, on a beautifully snowy Wednesday morning, Thomas Williams was officially discharged. As Mark gently helped his frail but smiling father toward the main exit, the old man suddenly stopped. He turned to look at Sophia, who was quietly watching them from the nurse's station. Thomas gave her a slow, deeply respectful nod, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of the massive debt he owed her, not just for saving his life, but for the profound wisdom she possessed. Mark turned his head and locked eyes with Sophia one final time before walking out into the freezing Boston air. As she watched the two men slowly disappear into the swirling white snow, Sophia allowed herself a small, genuine smile. True healing, she profoundly realized in that quiet moment, is never about perfectly erasing the deep, painful scars of the past, but rather learning how to carry them with quiet grace and dignity. Time does not simply magically fix our broken pieces. It gently teaches us exactly how to arrange them into a beautiful, complex mosaic of human resilience. When we stubbornly spend years building massive emotional walls to protect our fragile hearts from the lingering pain of old, devastating mistakes, we routinely forget that those exact same heavy walls inevitably keep out the necessary warmth of forgiveness. Life, much like the rapidly changing seasons of this beautiful snowy city, is relentlessly moving forward, constantly asking us to adapt and to bravely forgive not just others, but deeply forgive ourselves for the precious time we have foolishly lost. The greatest, most meaningful victories in this fleeting life are rarely ever found in building massive corporate empires or maintaining flawless medical records, but rather in finding the quiet, immense courage to stand entirely bare in the freezing cold and finally allow a heavily frozen heart to slowly thaw. We simply cannot rewrite the painful chapters we have already lived, nor can we undo the tragic moments we walked away from those who truly loved us. Yet, if we are incredibly brave enough to face the silent, haunting echoes of our shared history without our heavy armor, we might just discover that the massive, empty space left behind by a painful goodbye can eventually become the solid, enduring foundation for a much more mature, profoundly beautiful understanding of deep human connection.